couple minutes here to file in, get everything situated on Zoom before we really start cracking into things. First off, just want to say welcome to Andrew, Apex Pro, professional driver as well. Andrew, thanks for joining us. We're excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun.
It'll be good times. I know we talk a lot about data, so it'll be fun to make it more simple for everyone. I think it's a pretty intimidating thing. I know when I got into the sport, it's like, whoa, I've got all these squiggly lines in front of me. So learning how to simplify it and get straight to the point is pretty important. Awesome.
Yeah.
So I think we've got a critical mass just to go ahead and jump right in. So first off, my name's Dion from Racers360. With me here is Andrew from Apex Pro. Fantastic company. We've kind of been working together for quite a long time now. And we're really excited to have Andrew here. So for anyone that's maybe a little bit not familiar with Racers360, just wanted to give you a quick background. Hey there on the chat as well. Thanks for joining in. If you guys want, chime in on the chat. It'll be Andrew for the most part talking. I'll be on the chat going back and forth. We are going to have a Q&A at the end. We want you guys asking questions throughout it. For questions, it's best if you guys can just kind of move your mouse on the screen. At the bottom, you'll see a menu, and it'll be a Q&A box. So as we're going through, if you've got questions, hit that Q&A box, type your question in there. It'll be easier for us to not miss it at that point. And if you guys just want to chime in and jump in and kind of talk about things, I'll be on the chat while Andrew's talking, and we can kind of go back and forth. With this, if you really enjoy webinars, if you enjoy track guides, if you're a fan of improvement, we'd love for you guys to obviously check out Apex Pro and make sure you're trying their units. With that as well, I'd love to have you visit Racers360.com. We've got some amazing personalized coaching services. We also have something called the Driver's Lounge. There we have more than 36 corner-by-corner track guides made from our amazing race car coaches, most of which you'll see on IMSA race weekends or even IndyCar race weekends. With there, we also have lots more webinars, partner discounts. So if you guys are stocking up on new Nomex underwear, you might be able to find some nice discounts there. And if you're looking at an Apex Pro unit, you might want to be subscribed. I'm just going to throw it out there. Best of all, for everyone joining today, we have a 10% discount on that. So I will throw that link in the chat. And from there, I'll throw it over to Andrew, and let's get right into talking about data.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Dion. I'm a Driver's Lounge subscriber myself, so trying to get all those benefits. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely check it out. Like you said, there might be a little Apex Pro nugget in there for those of you that might not already own an Apex Pro. Sure. So we'll start with how we get some of the data into the app that we're going to be talking about. So Dion sent out an email earlier for everyone that was signed up for the event that had 3 different sessions in it. So if you don't have an Apex Pro, the app's free to download. That was also in the email. So feel free to ask questions while we go through this process. I'm happy to talk about, Apex Pro specific stuff at any point. But once we get into looking at data, it's going to really be system agnostic. So whether you're using Apex Pro or another product, this is going to be stuff that is probably going to look pretty familiar, or at least be something that you've heard of or have friends or, people are telling you this is something that you should know about. So I had a couple of questions from just some folks. I know Mike Cooper, you reached out. Some other people were asking how we get the files into the app. So I'm going to start there when we start looking at data. And then we're going to jump into these 3 different sessions. One's focused on the speed versus distance plot, or the speed trace, which you hear talked about a lot, and especially in professional racing, right? The speed trace is kind of the money trace, right? That's what every other data point is influencing, and ultimately is kind of the bottom line. And then we're going to talk a little bit about longitudinal G and lateral G. So if you've watched Apex Pro related content on our Facebook page or YouTube page, or however you get your information, you're probably going to be familiar with some of the stuff we're going to talk about here. But this has actually been kind of a process that we've been kind of learning how to deliver and have a high success rate at explaining. So we're going to end with the friction circle. And for those of you that have questions about that, that'll be a good time to ask it, and how that relates to what the Apex Pro lights mean. So we're only going to talk about those really briefly at the end, and hopefully that'll pique your interest enough to want to learn more. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen over, and Dion, feel free to stop me at any time if you want to jump in. I'll definitely lean on you a little.
just as a reminder for anyone that's on the desktop, Zoom does this thing where as Andrew shares his screen, it's probably going to go full screen on your end, which hides the chat. So just maybe hit your escape button. It'll kind of hide that full screen, so the chat's over there on your right-hand side. If you don't see the chat, just kind of scroll over where you see our faces, maybe hide our face with that mouse thing. At the bottom, you'll see some links for chat and the Q&A as well. So you can click those so you can ask questions or chime in.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go back to my email browser, actually. So I'm using Gmail. And what I'm looking at right now is one of the sessions that we sent over the email. So if you tapped the Dropbox folder link that Dion shared, you would see some files that look like this right here, where it says .apex data. So when we're looking at this, and I'm using my iPad right now. So if you're looking at this and you see that type of file from an iPad, iPhone, an iDevice of sorts, you're going to tap that file, and that'll give you some options about how to open that file. So we're looking in the top right corner here, and this is for people that use Apple stuff. You're going to be super familiar with this process. You're going to tap this little export button. It's the square with the triangle, and then you can do several things with the file. It's going to give you a lot of options. You can actually airdrop it directly to someone without even downloading it. So if you ever have that need, I actually do that quite frequently when I'm sharing stuff between my iPhone and my iPad. You should have an option to copy to Apex Pro. Now, if you don't use the app very much or you just downloaded it, that might not appear right there. So you'll need to tap More, which is right here on the far right. And then it'll give you some suggestions. You might have a much longer suggestion list. I only have like 4 or 5 apps maybe on this iPad, so I don't have a lot of suggestions. But if you have, this is your primary device and you've got, all the different applications that you use, this is going to be a longer list. But this should allow you to open up the data into Apex Pro. And when you tap it, it's going to appear like this. Just like you're seeing on the screen here, you get the session imported indication, and then you'll have to go find that session. So the name of the session is how we can search for that session. And Dion, I can't see the questions or anything. All I see is the iPad screen. So if there's anyone,
I'll cover that. So if anyone chimes in here has questions, like I said, message on the chat or put it in the Q&A, and I'll make sure Andrew sees those.
Great. That sounds good. Awesome. So we can actually search in the Apex Pro app, and this is a pretty recent feature. So if your app is on an older version, make sure to update to the most recent one. If you have your app set on auto update, you're all set. So if you tap where we see search right here at the top, just your standard search bar, we can search the file. So the name of that file was example longitudinal G session. So I can actually search it by the name, and you'll start to see different options appear. Or you can search it by the racetrack, and you'll start to see those options appear. So like I can see it right here. Look at, this is the speed trace example file. So we'll go ahead and start there. So like I said, we're going to look at the speed trace, longitudinal G, and then the friction circle. And mainly because I had really good example data for those. So we'll show you kind of some good behavior, bad behavior examples. And that should be a really good way to get started. So feel free to ask questions. We'll go ahead and jump into this data file right here. So just tap the file and open it up. I won't disclose who these drivers are, just to
So just to jump in here as well, I think a lot of questions that we get at Racers360 is like, what channels do you need to look at? And we often see photos where there's like 15 different channels open and people diving deep into it. From my perspective in my racing career, I never looked beyond really speed. If I had throttle position and brakes, I use that. If not, lat long G, perfect. And delta time. That was like really it. So the nice thing about what we're going to look at today is it's all you really need to look at. Of course, we all learn in different ways. Some of us have more of the engineering, analytical minds. Maybe you want to dive deeper into it, and you can do that. So I think we'll be able to cover really all the bases with what you've got up here, Andrew.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if you do, love data overload and you want to have a ton of different things, this will be really useful. We're going to mostly focus on the shapes of the trace. So like Dion was saying, even in a professional race situation during data review, you're still going to look at all this stuff. And these are, it's probably assumed that you already understand what we're going to talk about here in that environment. But this is really important. So when we're looking at our speed trace, this is our speed versus distance trace, and that's the bottom option here, right? At the top, we see our our track map. I like to toggle to longitudinal G on the track map because I find that to be a very intuitive way to look at the track from a color perspective. It's very obvious that when it's red, we're braking. When it's green, we're accelerating. And we might use this as a reference, but right now we're mostly going to talk about this lower speed trace. If you have the data, I would definitely recommend following along. Or if you have a notebook or something, there's probably going to be a couple things you might want to write down. You can also toggle this upper channel selector here and view speed over the course of the track, but I don't find that to be as intuitive of a view. So I would suggest to look at longitudinal G. You'll notice that all the colors on this screen, this top screen here, they get scaled by the channel that you select. So the colors are going to change every time you choose a different channel. But in general, when you're looking at Apex Pro stuff, and this goes for other stuff as well, but just speaking from our end, red is going to be a highly negative value and green is going to be a highly positive value, right? So it'll go red, orange, yellow to light green to dark green. So basically, the warmer the color, the more negative the value, the cooler the color, the more positive the value for those.
Sometimes we want highly negative numbers too, though, right?
What's that?
Sometimes we want highly negative numbers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we'll go back to long G here. So we're viewing, where we're braking, where we're accelerating. And the main thing that we want to do for starters with the speed trace is, depending on the system that you're looking at, this might look a little different, but you definitely want to identify what your axes are. So on the bottom here, we've got distance, and I will change my indication here. So we've got a distance axis right here. So starting at the start finish and driving around the track back to the start finish here on the far right. And then right here on the left side, going from the bottom to the top here is speed. So speed is in miles per hour. In Apex Pro, distance is actually going to be in meters. Most other systems you're looking at, you're going to see distance in feet. So that's a big thing to know. We're probably going to change it to feet. If I have anything to do with it, it'll probably be feet soon, but you might be able to choose. So just stay tuned on that one. But what we're looking at here is speed versus distance. And that's what creates the shape of this trace that we're looking at. So if the trace is accelerating, if we're going up like right here, speed would be increasing as distance increases, right? If we're going down, speed would be decreasing as distance increases, right? If it's flat, like right here, speed is going to be maintaining, or the speed is going to be relatively the same. So those are just kind of the very critical things to look at first. If it's positive accelerating value, speed trace is going to go up. If we're decelerating negative value, speed trace is going to go down. So that's kind of where we want to start. So now that we kind of have an idea about what the axes mean, speed and distance, and what values they are, or what meters, feet, kilometers, centimeters, whatever we're looking at, we want to look at the shape. And the shape is really critical on the speed trace. So I'll point out a couple of things. And this is what I would call a bad example speed trace. And this driver is relatively unfamiliar with the racetrack. He's in a pretty high horsepower car. And a lot of times we'll see these shapes in the speed trace in this scenario. So this is fairly normal. But what we're looking at is the top of the speed trace at first. There's a process we can follow with the speed trace that's really straightforward. And it starts with the top. So when you're looking at your own data, ask yourself, what does the top of my speed trace look like? Is it rounded? Does it kind of curve like we see here, where I have all these different peaks circled in the red circle? Or is it sharp? Does it have an aggressive edge to it? Does anyone want to guess which one's better? If you've watched any of our stuff, you probably know. Okay. Of course, we want to see the aggressive, right? Because like we just described earlier, we're accelerating and then we're decelerating. And on the racetrack, there's really no value to coasting before we decelerate, right? There's no situation where we want to come off the throttle and coast before we apply the brake pedal, right? There are definitely situations, and we'll get to this in a minute, mid-corner, where there might be a hesitation before we go back to throttle. But when we're looking at the top of the speed trace, this curve basically means that we have what we might call helium foot on the throttle, or we're going to slowly be releasing the throttle, or maybe even just off the throttle and on the brake, and we think we're doing it quickly and we're not. So tactically, if you see this, if you're looking at a data session that's yours right now, not just the sample data, and you're going, ooh, I see some curves, right? the implementation for that, or what can I do? I just go out and attack the brake pedal, brake earlier, just practice off throttle on brake. This was something I was guilty of my first pro race at Road America. I had this problem everywhere, and I didn't realize that I was having this problem. And when we see this shape on the speed trace, this is not like a huge, massive, easy to pick up on issue. And in our mind, when we're on the track, this happens really quickly. So it could just be a really, really, really subtle release of the throttle. You might not even realize you're doing it. How do you fix this, Dion?
Yeah, so I always like to, I'm not one that goes super in depth on like the physics of the sport, but I also like trying to explain why this is a problem. Obviously, when you're not at full throttle, you're not going fast. But some of the underlying issues here is when you slowly start to release off the throttle. And for me, this is more so than that gap between the throttle and the brakes. A bigger issue is as you approach a brake zone, slowly coming off the throttle. We see it a lot. One of the issues that causes really two ones. One is the weight transfer of the car. Everything we do as a driver revolves around weight transfer. And when you slowly come off the brakes, the weight doesn't efficiently move forward. It doesn't actually even move forward as much. It's as if the weight kind of gets lost in the middle of the car. So you don't have the max amount of grip that's possible because of that slow release. So even if you slowly come off of it and then brake hard, your maximum G's in the brakes will actually be lower than what you can achieve with a quick pop off, quick efficient movement off the throttle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is, I don't care what car you're driving, there's going to be some downforce on the car. Even if it's minimal, there's some. And that downforce works better at higher speeds, which means you have the most amount of grip at the very initial point of the brake zone. So if you're slowly coming off the throttle and then kind of easing onto the brakes, you're not effectively using the weight transfer, and you're not using that last little bit of downforce. So I'm with you 100%. I think if you try to coach drivers and fundamentals, for me, fundamentals are good application of the initial brakes, and then really focus on coming off the brake pedal. We all want to be working on rolling more entry speed, on driving faster. That should be done first by coming off the brakes, by the brake release, not by trying to brake deeper or not by trying to, coast into a brake zone and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times what we're seeing here, these curved tops of the speed trace will heavily influence that brake release because many times when we're hesitating and we're kind of, anticipating reaching the corner, we're going to be braking a little earlier than we need to, especially if we're in this scenario where we're letting off the throttle, the car's coasting and actually slowing down. We can see in this first circle right here, this car actually slows down. And I'm pretty confident the driver had not started to apply the brakes until right here, where we start to see the speed trace decrease drastically. But Dion couldn't be more right there. And especially in cars that you drove, Dion, where you've got like GT3 spec cars that have tons of aero, or even in, Bill Griffin in your spec E46, right? There's still a frontal area on the car. And think about on the interstate, right? If you're in the, let's say the top of third gear at interstate speeds, right? You're at 75 miles an hour, 6,000 RPM in third gear. If you let off the throttle, how quickly does that car slow down? Right? It slows down fast, much faster than we realize if we were to sit there and just watch the RPM, right? So if we're, there's a lot of things that affect it, right? It's not only aero, it's just that drag created by the front of the car, compounded with any aerodynamic downforce that's forcing the car down. And then also the drivetrain inertia is going to naturally slow the car down because we're usually not, cruising along in sixth gear at 70 miles an hour, right? We're probably near the top of the rev range at any point. So there's a lot of reasons why that's really important. So from a self-coaching perspective, that's the easiest thing. And the reason we talk about this first in data is because like Dion said, the brake release is really more important when we're really looking at our fundamentals. But this is probably the easiest thing to self-diagnose. And because data can be intimidating, I like to start with a success, right? If you don't see this happening anywhere in any of your data, this is not something you need to worry about. It's something that you can go and help other people with, though, or point them in the right direction. But if you do see this happening in certain places, especially in corners, let's say like the back straightaway at Sebring here, right? We're not turning before we brake here, especially in this car. We're braking in a straight line first. We want to see that sharp, jagged edge. Now, there are situations where this might be a little modified, right? If we're in a corner where we're cornering and we have some other load in the car. But for now, we're just talking globally about how we approach the brake pedal.
Sorry, I just to expand a little bit. I thought it might be helpful. I know Sebring well, but regardless, every time you're out there, you're finding where the track grip is. You're getting yourself up to speed. So, to take turn 7 at Sebring, and for everyone that doesn't know Sebring, that is the really big hairpin here. As you can see, big brake zone, crank it to the right. I know in the GT3 cars, for the most part, I know that, hey, I'm going to be braking about the 4 cone there. But in a car that I don't know, I still, and I've got that like a bit of an unknown. With most part, we're all pretty decent at saying, hey, this is going to be a conservative brake zone. So what my goal is, what I'm trying to achieve is to brake conservatively, but to be aggressive up to that conservative brake zone, brake hard, and then I'm going to be coming off the brakes. And I might get off the brakes completely before I've even turned in, and I'll coast in. And now I know next lap, I can go a little bit deeper. I can go a little bit deeper. I can go a little bit deeper. So what can help in this situation to help you avoid the like slowly releasing, where should I be going, is to try to identify by other videos, by curated onboard videos, another driver's lounge thing we do, and other things like that, where's a conservative brake zone? I'm not going to try to go up to my deep points, and this can work for new tracks, and it can work for places you know really well.
Yeah.
Pick that, hit it. That matters so much more. We've all heard, like, you always get beyond the brakes or the throttle. That's BS. If you've heard that before, leave it out of your mind. Coasting's okay. We believe in coasting, especially when you've got priorities as a driver, and it puts the priority on the right fundamental, which is avoiding what we're looking at here.
Yeah. So let's just look at, just focusing on the top of the speed trace. Let's just look at another data session and I'll just pick one that I might be familiar with. I might not. Yeah, this will work. So let's look at the top of these. This is my data. This is from a rental car, from an undisclosed rental car company. So the only reason I wanted to show this data is because there are some people that will say, well, you have to respect the balance of the platform, right? You can't just attack the brake pedal. And I do understand if the car is doing something that you don't expect, you should probably consider, something with your setup, probably a damper change or an alignment change. But this was in a rental car on 600 treadwear street tires, and I was able to come off the gas and onto the brake pedal as quickly as I possibly could. And I actually had to challenge myself to go even quicker because I haven't been to Sebring in 6 or 7 years at this point. This was last weekend. And so I was still familiarizing myself with the track. And this is by no means, I'm not tooting my own horn at all. It's just the right shape, and that's what we're looking for. So that's what we want to see in the top of our speed trace. Something looks like that.
And a subtle note there, if you also look at the bottom of his speed traces, they're also a little bit more angular than the other drivers. And that's often something we want to see too. Again, that one depends much more on the type of corner, but for the most part, there's a little subtle difference there. That's a nice thing to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a perfect segue because that's where we're going next.
Love it. We did not like that.
Excellent. Yeah. So for those of you who maybe didn't see what I did with the actual app itself there, I went down to this add another session option right here. And I was able to pick another session from the same track. So now I have this driver's data up here, and then I've got some of my data from my my lovely rental car down here. So we can compare 2 different sessions at once, which is going to help us a lot. But we'll go back up to this lap right here, this 238 lap, and we're going to look at the bottom of the speed trace now. So we got the top figured out. We know what the top of the speed trace is showing us. Now let's look at the bottom. So like Dion already emphasized, the brake release is really, really key. So there's a bunch of different ways to attack this. I really like to start with a corner that we know is like a hard threshold brake, high speed to low speed style corner. Most tracks have them, almost anywhere. If you're just thinking corners off the top of your head, entry to the keyhole at Mid-Ohio, right? Big speed on entry, slowing the car way down. Turn 10A at Road Atlanta, turn 1 at VIR. Those types of corners. And at Sebring, I'm going to look at turn 7. And especially since Dion already mentioned it, we're looking at turn 7. So the first thing we want to do is actually determine where we are on the speed trace relative to the track. Especially when we're looking at the bottom, because the bottom is much more corner dependent, like Dion said. There's some general things that are good, but we do need to know where we are on the track to know whether or not this shape is desirable or not. So I'm going to take the slider right here in the bottom left and move it forward until the car gets to turn 7. There we go. Awesome. So now we can see my crosshairs here on the data trace, on the speed trace on the bottom is correlated to my car's location. So now we can kind of just determine that this trough right here, this base of the speed trace, is going to be the apex at turn 7. And this is a really slow corner. We're looking at 34 miles an hour right here at the base of the corner, right? 34 miles per hour is our minimum corner speed for this driver. What we need to know about the speed trace here is anytime we have a big old gap like this where we're going from high speed to low speed, we want the speed trace to look like a V. For those of you that have been tuned into some of this data discussion before, you've heard a lot about U's and V's. We want to make sure the first thing we're looking at, and this is titled low-hanging fruit, so that's why we're focused on this. This is the easiest way to identify low-hanging fruit. If you're looking at this speed trace right here for turn 7, and it looks like a big old U, like that, right, then that's, immediately there's a problem there. You're probably slowing down way too much, way too early. Maybe you're braking all the way down the straightaway. Maybe you got into traffic, and there's all sorts of reasons, but we want to just go to that threshold brake corner and we want to establish what shape it looks like. We're not even saying, hey, could we go faster or not? We're not there yet. We're just going, is the shape the right shape? And then for other corners on the speed trace that have a similar speed, meaning they're at a similar place on the speed graph. So let's see what that looks like. If you just draw a line, this is 34 miles per hour, right? Where this blue line goes right here, look at the other places that are close to that line, the other valleys or the troughs of the speed trace, and make sure those are V's as well. And if they're not, go ahead and look into that. Why is it not? Why is it not a V? All right, and we can talk a little bit about how to analyze that. But before we do that, let's talk about faster corners. So we know slow speed corners need to be a V. In my experience, a slow speed corner in a street style car, which most of us are driving, not a super aero dependent car, but a street based car, is usually below 60 miles per hour minimum corner speed. So the slowest part of the corner, right here, it's 34, is below 60. Once you get above 60, the corner starts to be usually more indicative of a higher speed corner or a medium speed corner. And I think the medium speed corners, in my opinion, and Dion, I don't know how you feel about this, but I think the corners that have a minimum speed of like 60 to 80 miles per hour can be the hardest corners, because you have to slow the car down a lot, but not too much. And you've got to get on the throttle early, but not too early, because you want to roll speed.
Yeah, it is really difficult. And it was funny. I was one of the webinars that's on the Racers360 platform. I was actually going through it. It's one of our coaches, Nelson Mason, did one on how to learn a racetrack. And I think what's really important, that where a lot of amateur racers go wrong, and it sounds really simple, but a lot of us don't, is understanding and going through a track and knowing what are our priorities in this corner. And if you look at turn 7, there's really 2 priorities in turn 7. One, maximizing time on full throttle into the brake zone. And then 2, how early can I get back to full throttle after the apex? If you focus on those 2 things, it's going to naturally form a V. Now, there's subtleties around that. And I feel like by choosing your priority, it's going to customize this a little bit more. So like at Sebring, to expand on what you're talking about before, turn 3 is kind of one of those more medium corners. Now, I think the speeds can be a lot lower than what you're looking at, but that's a corner where I think I want a little bit more of a U shape versus like a turn 7. Or then a turn 1 is definitely be more of a U shape. And I think turn 1 is actually a really fast corner, but it's one where it's really difficult, like you said, because it's easy to roll in too much entry speed and not pick up the throttle, or vice versa. So I think turn 1 is that right in the middle type of corner that's got a lot of entry speed, that you need to get back to full throttle. That's tough to find that right happy medium.
Yeah, absolutely. Turn 1 is at Sebring, for folks that haven't been there, it's this corner right here that we're looking at, but it's more than 90 degrees, but it's also really high speed. So this driver, you can see turn one is this base of the speed trace right here, high 70s mile per hour minimum speed. Let's look at the rental car speed here, right? Actually a little bit quicker, almost 80 miles an hour right through here. I think my minimum speed was like 76 or 78 miles per hour. And Dion, what's funny about you mentioning that, if you go to the very next lap here, you'll notice that I actually went 4 off right here at the exit of 1 through the dirt in the rental car.
More time.
That's right. I emphasized entry speed too much. And you can see where my minimum speed here was really good. It was really high, right? It was higher than the lap before. If I overlay the two of them, it was actually higher than the lap before, just subtly. But then I wasn't able to get to the throttle because I was trying to gather the car up on the exit. So it's all about priority. So that's turn one's a great example of a fast corner. And we'll go back to just a single lap being displayed here and talk about the shape of a faster corner. And I noticed in the comments, some folks were mentioning throttle and brake trace and stuff like that. And that's going to tell you a lot more information. But what I'll challenge yourself with is a quote that I think it was from Spider-Man. With more power comes more responsibility, or with great power comes great responsibility. Make sure you really understand the speed trace before you introduce other things, because it doesn't necessarily make it easier. It just adds more information. And if you can't truly gather information out of the speed trace first, then you don't want to add more to the equation. And I'll expand on my experience with that later and what I specifically mean. But basically, the speed trace can indicate a lot of different things, and you need to know what all those variables could be before you go looking at throttle position or brake position to determine, because you could end up diagnosing it incorrectly if you don't have that knowledge base. But let's just look at the shape of turn one right here. So this is turn one, like Dion said, it's a definitely a high speed corner where we want to roll speed in. It's not quite the fastest corner at Sebring, because this actually is a turn at Sebring, not in 110 horsepower or whatever it was, rental car. You don't have to actually lift the throttle there, but in Sebring turn one. So think about Mid Ohio turn one might be a little bit faster. Someplace like I don't know, any other corners that come to mind. South Bend at VIR maybe might be a little faster as well, but this is, yeah, there you go. Turn one, Road Atlanta. This is a fast corner, and it's fast, and we immediately know that the shape needs to be more of a U, because the minimum speed is well over 60 miles per hour. So now if you're not comfortable driving the track and you're driving really slow, the minimum speed might appear to be below 60 miles per hour. But when you're looking at data, and I'm assuming most people probably go to 5 or 6 of the same tracks, if you've got enough time on those tracks, this is going to be pretty obvious when you look at it. So what we want to do is just then go look at the bottom of the speed trace for the fast corners and make sure it's not a V. All right, make sure it's not a V, because if it is a V, one, you're probably over slowing the corner. You're probably slowing down way more than you need to. And you're probably also introducing too much weight transfer to the situation, right? If you go into a really fast corner and brake hard and late and carry all that weight over the nose, when you go to ask the car to turn, it's going to be really eager to turn in most situations. And that can spell trouble. If you carry a lot of brake pressure into turn one at Sebring and you braked really late and stuffed all that weight over the nose, you can definitely point the car right at the inside wall.
And just to hopefully not complicate things, but there's always, as with anything in this sport, there's happy mediums, right? The other thing that we see a lot, and is very typical in amateur racing that we like to avoid at almost any cost, is what we look at, like a flat bottom on the slope of that line. So what you want to see is, you don't want to, in this corner like this, you don't want a V, but you also never want to see a flat bottom once you're comfortable. I mean, look, there's when I go out for Sebring turn one the first time, I'm going to have a flat bottom because I'm getting up to speed. But on your fast laps, you always want a nice kind of slow, and then it should almost immediately start ticking up again. We want to avoid that kind of maintenance. And this one, I just pointed out because I saw a little bit of that. And of course, hope that wasn't you in the rental car first lap, but it's something that we see quite a lot.
Yeah, no, this is exactly what was going on here. So obviously it looks more like a U than a V, so that's good. But what I was doing here is I was actually turning in really early. And I noticed that that's just some data that I have mentally from the track, but also if I go and look at my track map reference and where I actually need to be turning in, I just wasn't calibrated to the track. And so I ended up coasting for longer than I really needed to in the middle of the corner, because evidenced by the very next lap, if I turned in the same place with more speed, I was going to run off the track, and I did. So I actually ended up adjusting my turn-in point, and everything was better. And then my speed trace started to look more like a U. So think about those fast corners. That's a really good example. When you see that flat bottom of the speed trace, the story that that's telling you is hesitation squeezing back to throttle. And that can be a lot of things before that, but a lot of times it's turning in too early. And sometimes fast corners, it's easy to turn in early because the corner's approaching quickly. Your eyes go ahead early, as they should, and your hands follow your eyes instinctively. And especially in a corner like this where it's more than 90 degrees, the car's really having to wrap around this inside wall here to get back to your exit, which is way down here. You really have to be patient with your turn in. I see a lot of people turn in really early for turn one at Road Atlanta. And overall, faster corners, you usually are turning in earlier, right, than a slower corner, right, because you want to roll corner speed. But geometrically speaking, it's still pretty close to a geometric apex. Whereas in a slower speed corner, you want to turn in a little later so that you're getting the car pointed towards your exit sooner. So in a fast corner, just look for that flat line, right? And we can go and look through this driver's data as well. And actually on this lap, great example, what do we see right here? We see it not only flat line, but decrease, right? And this car, this was actually a Camaro Z28, so a lot of contact patch. So that could just be off throttle and a lot of tire scrub, or that could be a subtle, still kind of safety application on the brakes. So that's something that we want to look at. Again, we've already diagnosed these tops of the speed trace here, so we're kind of looking at the bottoms. But to summarize all that, start at the top, look for the curvy top, and make sure that that's not there. That's the first thing that you want to attack, because like Dion said, make a conservative brake point, go attack the brakes, transfer all that weight, get a lot of G's to decelerate the car, and then start releasing that brake pedal really early so that you get the car kind of settled and balanced for the middle part of the corner or for your turn in. And then for the fast corners, make sure you've got that U shape on the bottom of the speed trace. And for the slow corners, that V shape. And always try to avoid that completely flat shape in the trace, which just means there's no increase or decrease in speed, right? We always are usually going to be either slowing down or speeding up. So those are the really big things to know about the speed trace. Do we feel like we need to beat anything else up here?
I think from my perspective, it's good. Of course, if people have questions, we could start using that Q&A button, start lining those up. I think we can move on to the next one, and then we'll come back and go through any Q&A questions at the end, I would say.
Awesome. That sounds great.
Feel free to chime in on the chat as well. But if you've got questions that you want answered, I think the Q&A helps us make sure we don't miss that within the chat.
Great. So the next thing that we're going to look at is some data that I sent, and it's from Barber Motorsports Park. So you can either search for Barber, or you can look at the track selection here if you're in your app, if you've already uploaded the data into your app. If you haven't, then go to find this file. It's going to be called example 2. Look at longitudinal G. This file right here that my mouse is over, right there. And so we're going to tap that, and we're going to look at longitudinal G forces for this one. We're going to depart from the speed trace briefly, and we're going to talk about what is longitudinal G and what are we looking for specifically in our data to note what we're doing right, what we're doing incorrectly. And longitudinal G is going to be really, really representative of our braking habits. And I say habits because driving is the type of thing, and the reason that Racers360 exists, the reason Apex Pro exists, is because it's a coaching opportunity, right? These are not things we can go out and fix immediately. So we're going to be looking at some habits here. And this particular driver has a pretty bad habit that we want to make sure that we identify and get rid of. So we've already got long G displayed on the track map on the top here with our channel selector. Let's also go down here to this middle selection where we see speed and pick longitudinal G as well. So that's going to change the shape drastically of this trace that we see down here, this graph. Same measurement down here. We have distance over the course of the track, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 meters. But now going up the y-axis here, we have longitudinal G-forces. I think it's really important, Dion, and a lot of things we talk about with data is always to identify the zero axis. And I think that's something that if you're looking at your data right now and you're going, I don't know what this means. If you're in that bucket, which is the vast majority of people that are looking at their data, find the zero axis and just draw a line, annotate on your screen, or just mentally know that's where zero is. Because I think that's extremely important to have as a visual reference. So I'm going to leave this red arrow right here. For longitudinal G, zero represents zero acceleration in what we would call the x-axis, or just think about the fuzzy dice hanging from your rearview mirror, because we all drive cool 70s Cadillacs, right? If the dice are going towards the windshield and the driver's being pushed into the harnesses, right? Then this is going to be decreasing. There's going to be negative G. That's going to be decelerating, like we see braking, like right here at turn 5 at Barber. If you're being pushed towards the back of the car, right, and the car is accelerating, the fuzzy dice are moving back towards you, that's going to be positive on the longitudinal G channel. So that's going to be going up. Anytime the G's are relatively flat, like right here, actually, you know what? I won't answer. Let's throw that one to Q&A. If anybody knows what this represents right here, let us know. And it's I'll give you a hint. It's not hard acceleration and it's not hard deceleration. What does the flat and longitudinal G trace mean? Because that can also help us identify where that is on the track. Cool. So that's kind of what we're looking at when we look at longitudinal G. This driver in particular is suffering from not being really comfortable attacking the brake pedal. He's not wanting to brake hard in the areas where we really want to be braking hard. And so we're going to talk about how to identify that, both with the longitudinal G trace and with the track map that you guys see above. Did we get an answer on that one?
Someone guessed coasting, so I was not quite.
All right, not quite. Let's wait for another one. We're not going to give it away. This is not the speed trace.
The next answer we got was maintenance. That technically can be, but I don't think that's really what we're looking at here either.
Nope, not what we're looking at. If we're trying to identify, I'll give a little bit more information, trying to identify where on the racetrack is this flat part of the longitudinal G trace. What would the driver be doing?
No. So I'll tell you what I'm thinking. How about that?
Sure.
Not riding the rev limiter either. So when you get close to the top speed of the car, your acceleration is dying down. So I'd say that driver is still probably flat out, but it's not accelerating as hard. Yep. So you see it come closer to zero.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have to take a switch in our brain and flip it from speed to G-forces, which are two different things. G-forces represent acceleration. Speed represents the speed the car is traveling, right? So as speed increases, acceleration decreases. There might be a few exceptions to that, especially with boost by gear on modern hypercars, supercars. McLaren does it. They actually add torque as the gear increases. So there's more torque in second than first, more torque in third. And some of those cars actually accelerate harder in a higher gear. I can tell you right now, this is a Camaro. This isn't a McLaren. So that's not the case. Anytime we see this flat line, that's usually wide open throttle. And you can usually identify that because you'll see an increase and then you'll see it kind of flatten at the top and then you'll see a decrease. We'll also sometimes see these little divots right here, right? I see one right there. I see one right there. They look kind of similar. Maybe I see one right there that looks a little similar. Let's make that another question. What are these divots in the, and that's the best word I can come up with.
I was answered like this.
Oh, did we get one?
They're on it. Yeah. Gear change shifting. I think.
Nailed it.
Yeah. Nailed it.
Awesome. And that's easy to look at in the longitudinal G trace, because if we sit there and I like to actually physically look through the trace and put my body through what the car's going through. So if I'm looking at one of those divots, I'm wide open throttle. The weight's kind of mostly rearward, but it's pretty neutral. And when I shift, I go boom, right? Especially with 3 pedals and a stick shift. Even in most, shiftable automatic transmissions, you're going to see that in your longitudinal G trace. Some dual clutch transmissions, if you're, driving a Ferrari or a PDK Porsche, that's going to be much less significant. It might not even be visible in the longitudinal G trace. It's definitely not visible in the speed trace. So now that we have our flip switched in our brain for G's as opposed to speed, this should make this process simpler. So again, I'm going to go to a corner on the track, and it's going to be turn 5 for those of you that are familiar with Barber. For those of you not familiar with Barber, think any high-speed to low-speed threshold braking corner. So we just talked about turn 7 at Sebring, Dion. We just talked about 10A at Road Atlanta, the keyhole, entry to the keyhole, which would be turn 2 at Mid-Ohio if you're on the pro course. Turn 1 at Watkins Glen is going to be a pretty hard break. Anywhere that's like, throwing the weight over the nose, toss the anchor out the rear to slow the car down, deploy the parachute, whatever it is. That's what we want to look at here. And this is the first thing that I want, that if you're especially using the Apex Pro app, I find this extremely easy to diagnose. I'm going to dive right into here. And again, I'll reiterate the colors. Red is going to be hard deceleration. Green is acceleration. So therefore, orange is a little bit less deceleration. Yellow is going to be neutral or close to 0. And then green is positive. Does anyone want to guess before, because I think this is a lot of fun, and I hope y'all are learning from this, but does anyone want to guess what this blip is right here? This little, and let me put a different color on here so it makes a little bit more sense. What I'm looking at and what I want you to help me identify is this change in color that we see right here. Hard braking, then we see this yellow, and then we see braking again. What's that driver doing with their right foot?
So we've got a off the brake. We've got a Malik's moment. We've got a blip shift. By blip shift, I think is what then Bill meant. Yep. Downshift, heel toe shifting.
Nailed it. All the above. Those can all be correct in this situation. Just from looking at a lot of data, I'll tell you most of the time your downshifts, you don't need to see an adjustment in longitudinal G that's this dramatic. So what I'm going to do, and this is going to be interface specific, I'm going to zoom in and then I'm going to tap the darkest part of the lap right here.
And sorry, just to jump in there really quick, because it's just ironic. Today we just posted, this driver's probably I'm going to guess is heel toe in here is the shifting that we're looking at.
I think it is. It's just a really dramatic lift off the brake pedal. Yeah.
Which we don't, I always have my coach hat on. It's hard to take it off, but it's something we want to avoid. That's something that I actually struggled with early in my career, was how do you get the right foot angle to be more consistent on the brakes? Literally this morning, we posted an in-depth article on heel toe downshifting and how to become better at it, more consistent at it. So just want to throw that out there on our Facebook page, totally free. Go look at it. If something like you struggle with, I think it'll be really helpful for you. So just want to throw that out there while we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of times when we see something like this, just to echo that, a lot of people tend to place, and I've ridden with people that do this, tend to place heel toeing as a priority over braking. And so just fundamentally, your heel toe is not as important as it is to slow the car down to the proper speed for the corner. And you don't actually have to heel toe. You can be really slow with the clutch and release it late in the corner when the car's slowed down, and everything will be fine. But heel toe just makes everything a lot nicer. The transmission likes it more. It's a good rhythm to establish in your driving. There's a million reasons to do it, especially those of you driving cars with more fragile transmissions. I started out racing an old Alfa Romeo, and I actually had to double clutch at first. So it's really emphasized in those types of cars. But you're exactly right here, Dion, and everyone that answered that, if you said blip, if you said release the brake pedal, you're all correct. So this driver's braking pretty hard, -0.9. And we'll talk a little bit about long G values as well, but just know 0 and -1. -1 is very close to threshold braking on a street tire, right? Anything from a 200 tread wear. I actually saw almost -1 on my 600 tread wear tires on my rental car. So -1 is a pretty attainable amount of brake or amount of deceleration on most anything, right? Like a GT3 spec car like Dion's driven, right? You're going to see probably double that or more in your deceleration. Yeah, 2.5. There you go. That's a lot of deceleration. Indy cars will see almost 3.5, 4 in some situations, especially braking uphill. I digress. So this driver's braking hard. And then there's a big old release of the brake. So now I'm going to tap the lap on this yellow part of the lap right here and see what the value is. So we went from 0.9 back here to -0.2 right here, -0.9 to -0.2. Negative 0.2 is very close to coasting. Negative 0.2 usually means that the driver's still barely braking. In between -1 to -2, it can be a lot of different things, but I'll tell you right now, this driver is hardly decelerating the car at all. And then they go back to the brake pedal again here, back to negative 0.67. This particular corner, if you're familiar with it, it goes downhill really steeply. So a lot of drivers, so this is why I'm expanding on this. I think this is a downshift, but it could also be that this driver did this amount of braking and slowed the car down a lot and goes, I think I can release the brake pedal now. And then they got to this point in the corner right before they turned in and they went, uh-oh, I can't. All right, I'm not there yet. The car's not going slow enough. And so they squeezed more brake pressure before they turned. And that's pretty common in this corner because it's very steeply downhill. So it kind of catches you out, right? If you brake too early, it's easy to overslow because the corner's still flat. If you brake too late, it's really downhill. And so it's easy to go a little too deep and not be able to get into the corner. But when we're
I just want to jump in there. A really important subtle note here. You heard us earlier talking about how it's okay to have that initial hard hit and then release off of it. Everything in this sport is about priorities, and it's about what's right to you. And that's one of the important things is everything we're talking about today, I think, are great guidelines to take to your own driving. But there's not going to be ever a one size fits all. And I think that's really important why coaching, why education it's important to be personalized to you because everyone has different instances. Everyone has different things that we're working on and we're different parts of the process. So for instance, if this driver was really new, I would look at the initial brake application, wouldn't really worry about the next part of it. Yes, it's not perfect, but there's priorities that we want to fix right. So what we could look at here is maybe they were doing what we were talking about initially. Or if they're an experienced driver that we're working on now the next bit, which is where you're starting to apply the throttle, how you're turning is entry speed or speed through the brake zone, then this becomes an issue. So just one important thing to know in the back of your mind is if you hear someone saying, hey, this is just what you have to do everywhere, run and hide. That's not the person you want to listen to. There's always degrees of change. Everything changes in the sport. So it's important for us to have priorities, but just know there's never going to be a one size fits all solution. It depends a lot on where you are in your driving, type of corner, the conditions. There's so many variables. And that's why, at Racers360, we've been really focused on making it our education coaching personalized to the user, personalized to you, because it's important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Everything has to be applied to your specific situation because we all learn a little differently. And hopefully the stuff we're talking about now is it's not going to be universal in how you apply the fixes to your driving, what you actually tactically go do in the car. But what we're looking at here is fairly universal as far as is this good or bad, right? And this is bad. And we know that. And as long as we know that, that's what we're trying to get out of data, right? We're not asking the data to tell us what to do yet, right? We're just trying to get something out of it. So I've done a couple things here. And real quick, I saw a question in the comments. Someone said the driver's off track. Yeah, they were braking in the grass. That's why they had to lift. No, this is just GPS overlaid on the track. For those of you that are familiar with other systems, you're going to see the same issue. The way GPS works, without digressing too much, is there's satellites obviously orbiting the Earth. We're not only using satellites launched by the U.S., but also Russia and China. So have you ever heard of GLONASS? GLONASS is just Russian GPS satellites. It stands for something else. It's not Global Positioning System. When the GPS shift occurs, basically when we're using 7 satellites, call it, when we have to shift and use a different satellite because one of those satellites dips beyond the horizon, this is what happens. And it's almost universal. The only way you can correct this, it doesn't even help if you have a higher end, higher frequency GPS. The only way you can correct this is by having a base station on the ground. So IndyCar teams, IMSA teams, a lot of times will run like a GPS base station off of their hauler to do ground corrections on their GPS. So even if you run a roof mounted GPS, it's going to be a little more precise, but you're still going to see this. And what you'll notice is that the whole track basically has been shifted in this direction just slightly. So it doesn't really, it's going to affect if you're looking at this line to go, hey, where was I exactly on the racetrack? It's going to be a little shifted. A lot of times it will actually be really, really, really close, But in this case, it's just shifted slightly to where the car's just in the grass right here. So we can assume he was probably just inside of the white line. I'll get back into it. If you're interested in learning more about that stuff, reach out to me offline, because we do a lot of stuff here. We actually do some other projects related to GPS, and I'm happy to share some info on that. I circled some stuff in the bottom trace here. I'm looking at the longitudinal G trace down below the map, and I can now see the the blue dot on the track. That blue dot is right here on the map. So just like on the speed trace, we want to actually be able to identify where on this longitudinal G graph is that on the track, right? And correlate those two. So I would strongly recommend, again, using the slider down at the bottom of the app. And this is a super easy way to do this. Just start dragging it slowly through the app and start to look at these places and start to make some correlations. So if you're looking at your app on your own, slide the slider forward and go, okay, this guy's, the line's decreasing. The line is red on the track. Now the graph actually on the bottom is increasing, and the color is getting closer to that yellow color. And right here, that yellow color is pretty prevalent, right? And we can see that the value here is closer to 0, right? Instead of -9, it's -0.43. The specific value at this point on the track is going to be right here. So that's going to show us the value of longitudinal G. At this point, it's -0.43, and then the distance on the track is going to be 1,067 meters. So we can see this right away in the longitudinal G trace. Not only can we see that this driver is braking, releasing brake, and braking again, but we can see it down here, right? We can actually see it in the longitudinal G trace. And what we also might notice is that that's something that's happening on a smaller scale in some other places on the lap. A lot of times these issues that we're talking about are global issues. If this racetrack had more threshold braking corners, I'd be willing to bet this driver would be doing this same thing in those other braking corners. So when you're looking at your own data, find a threshold brake corner, no matter what track you go to, and look and see if you have this big release in brake pressure. If you are heel towing and you're releasing a little bit of brake pressure, you're still going to see a little tiny divot, a positive divot this time in the longitudinal G graph. It's going to increase slightly, but you should only see a variation over here of about -0.1 to -0.15. If you're seeing a variation of -0.2, 0.3, right, a change of 0.2 or 0.3 G, then you're releasing too much brake pressure while you're heel towing. And so really emphasize the braking and not necessarily the heel toe. The reason I say there's always going to be a little bit is because when you depress the clutch, right, and the drive line's disengaged, that changes the acceleration of the car a little bit, because that's two wheels in most cases that are touching the ground, right, that just started basically free rolling. They have no drivetrain inertia anymore, right? So that is going to affect G-forces just a little bit. I don't want to get too deep into this, but basically what we're looking for here is, are you applying the brakes once, nice and consistently and hard, and releasing it as you get into the corner, or are you braking twice? So that's going to be easy, low-hanging fruit. If you see this coloration that we're looking at right here, immediately know to go out there and just apply the brakes once. When you feel your foot coming off the brake pedal, tell it to stay, right? Just stay there. Dion, you might want to speak more to how this is. I'll lean on you for the coaching part of it, but if we see this in the data, what would you suggest somebody does?
So it again depends a little bit on the corners. So turn 5 is a really difficult one because of the steep downhill. So if it was a flat corner, easy, brake a lot deeper. Here's one where I've got to really be able to dig deeper into it is, can they brake deeper? What you really have to do at turn 5 is you want your initial brake to happen before the hill starts to really go steep downhill. So what I think of right now at a high level is, hey, are they braking way too early, or are they at that point to where it's right before it starts to slope steep downhill? Now, no matter what, we don't want to see what's happening there as drastic as what they are doing with that much of release and that much of an add. But turn 5, it is a corner where I have in the past, depending on the car, released some off through the middle of the brake zone and actually added some towards the end. Actually, another corner like that could be turn 10A, where at Road Atlanta, where you're downhill and it compresses. So it's
Yep.
another instance where they're non-typical corners. A typical corner, you want sharp down, and then you want immediately to start releasing. So what I look for in a brake zone is, does the peak brake pressure come right away? Yes, good. Next thing is the shortest amount of time during the brake zone spent at peak brake pressure? Yes. So I want to see, again, another really, really sharp V at peak brake pressure. I want to hit it and then immediately start releasing. Now, mentally, you may not realize you're releasing, but you have to think about, as you decel, you're losing grip. So you might still be at the limit of the car, but you are coming off the brakes. So I want to see a slope that has a really sharp first line or straight up, and then a slow decel, maybe a little bit of a more constant brake pressure through a little bit of the brake zone, and then again, a really slow release at the end. No variations like up and down. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's pull up another what I would call a good example session. So this is the bad example. This is the double brake application. I'll call it that in this corner. And I'm going to pull up a good example of a lap that's done, at least a lap that I know what was done because I was driving the car, which I think is important to be able to speak to it intelligently and look at the difference. So let's just one more time, let's look at this shape. This is the whole corner sequence, right? Until this point, when this driver gets back to zero, that's when they go to throttle. So this is all turn 5. If I keep dragging the crosshair through here, you can see exactly where the driver picks up back on the throttle, which is somewhere right around here. And that's the exit of the corner.
Which is actually a good spot.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually excellent throttle application there. So this speed adjustment ended up kind of working for him, but he lost a lot of time in this whole area right here.
Yeah.
Well, let's quickly shift and just look at another lap. And again, I'm not saying this is exactly what your data. You should make your data look like mine. It's the best. That's not what I'm saying. I just know what was done in the car, and I want to show you the same exact corner on the track, but with a totally different approach to the corner. So this is the exact same place, right? We've got a little bit of a divot here in the bottom, and then the trace goes up at kind of like pretty steep slope, but not super steep, and then it goes steeper and you can actually see very distinctively at this point where I get on the throttle. So what's important to note, and that point's going to be somewhere right around here where that shape actually changes slope. So this is a hard application of the brakes and trying to maintain really, really hard deceleration. So when we're looking at longitudinal G, again, it's important to note this is acceleration. This is not brake pressure, but this is very, very heavily correlated to your brake input. So you can tell that I slammed on the brake pedal right here, and I'm at peak decel, like Dion said, as quickly as I can, ideally. But then right here in the corner, there's a little divot in deceleration. And let's see what that value is, because I gave y'all a hint on what this might be a minute ago. We'll do another question here. My peak rate of deceleration, is going to be about negative 0.92, negative 0.96 right there if we look at the far right side of the screen. And then in the middle of the brake zone here, I go back to about negative 0.86 or so, maybe a little bit less than that. What do you guys think that is? What's this little shape? And it's something we've already talked about pretty extensively, but I just want to pull it up because it looks different. What's this little divot right here?
First answer we got was trail braking. So not quite.
Nope, not yet. We're still at this point in the corner, right? We're still
straight line braking.
Yep, straight line, close to the beginning of the brake zone still, about halfway through.
I think Jason just nailed it with the downshift. John, heel toe. Yep.
Heel toe, that's it. So earlier I said when you heel toe, you're still going to see a change in acceleration. And it's mostly because when you depress the clutch, the car's in neutral basically, right? The drivetrain gets disengaged. So it's going to change how the car accelerates. That's why we see that divot right there. Did I release my foot off the brake pedal a little bit? Probably very slightly. That's something I practice really cognizantly to not do. So I did it as little as possible, but that's exactly what that is. Let's move forward a little bit further into the corner. And what I'll also add as an anecdote here, Barber just got resurfaced, so the track is very different than it was before. The asphalt's totally different. The grip level is different. It's actually much higher. The track's a lot smoother. So I'm actually on the throttle in this corner way sooner than I used to be. So where I'm going to put the cursor right now is going to be kind of when this longitudinal G trace starts to trend back upwards. And I say trend because it's still kind of going at like more of a gentle slope, and then it goes really steep. So what is this more gentle slope back up towards zero, or, you know, somewhat gentle slope represent? What's that? Yeah.
Oh, the right answer to this we saw just a little bit a second ago.
Yep.
I think, Joe, you had nailed it. Yeah, there we go. Trail braking.
Trail braking. Awesome. Trail braking. So if we're talking values, that's what the shape's going to look like. In long G, it's going to be a little more abrupt. In the speed trace, trail braking is going to kind of have somewhat of a hockey stick shape. So you're going to see a decrease in the speed trace, and then it's going to actually start to slope a little more subtly. And we can look at the speed trace with this as well, just to kind of emphasize that. On longitudinal G, it's going to be a little more dramatic, and instead of continuing to go down, it's going to go up. So the trace is going to start back up. This is evidence that we haven't just popped off the brake pedal, right? But we're releasing the brake pedal. And what I can also do is tap right here where I see this transition of color. This is the color progression we want to see as well. Remember, this is our bad example, color progression. This is our good example. We've got hard straight line braking. And then look at this blending from red to orange to yellow. And then once the green acceleration starts, it never stops, right? So I like to also kind of just like tap that specific part of the lap, and I'm looking for a longitudinal G value somewhere between negative 0.25 and negative 0.45, maybe negative 0.5. That's usually meaning that the car is now mostly committed to lateral G, lateral acceleration, but it's still decelerating. And this value right here, we're looking at negative 0.37. That's too much deceleration. And this is just off of looking at a lot of data and correlating it with throttle position, brake, everything else, right? There's so much we can get out of longitudinal G without having anything else. That's what I'm trying to emphasize here. Negative 0.37 is too much deceleration to be purely the scrub of the tire, right? When we turn and we enter the corner, the most deceleration we'll see from steering is usually about 0.2, negative 0.2 G. So negative 0.37 means the driver's foot is likely still on the brake pedal and probably coming off of it, because if this driver's approaching the trail brake concept correctly, they're releasing the brake all the way into the corner. So if you're looking at your data now, guys, first of all, red to orange to yellow to green, and then also go tap this just after turn in and look for what the value is here. And if you see negative 0.5, negative 0.6, that's probably a little too much deceleration. That probably means that you're going slower than you need to go. The car can actually carry more speed. And as a coach, I would say start to release the brake pedal sooner in the progression of the corner to try to roll a little more entry speed. If you see negative 0.1 here, or even a positive value here, that means there's no trail braking happening at all, right? You're already off the brake pedal, either coasting or maybe even going back to the throttle. That's really what I'm emphasizing with longitudinal G. That applies pretty much everywhere. It's going to be a little different in the faster corners, right? But apply the same things we talked about with the speed trace in the faster corners. We're not going to see quite as high peak values with longitudinal G. So as speed increases, right, we can create a lot more longitudinal G on the brake pedal, right, by attacking it. But most of the time when we enter a fast corner, we don't quite attack the brake pedal as hard. We're not going to actually ask the car to slow down as quickly. There's a lot of different reasons for that, but we're going to be decelerating a little less. So we can definitely look into that. But I want to let everyone who's involved kind of guide the conversation. We have one more example to look at if we want to, and it's about the friction circle, or the GG plot, traction circle, XY plot. There's a lot of different names for it. We don't necessarily have to go there. We can go straight into Q&A if we want to.
I would say let's leave some comments here. First few people to respond, if you'd rather do the Q&A or you'd rather go G-spot, we're happy to do either or. So if you have a preference, leave us a comment. If not, let's give people a couple minutes here. First vote for friction circle. We got a couple of friction circles, so I'd say let's go talk about friction circles quickly, and then we'll finish up with a Q&A.
Cool. We'll hop into the friction circle. So this was also a data session that was sent out in the email, and it was also from Sebring. So I'm going to go back into Sebring. If you uploaded this data into the app, you'll see. Oh, let me get my annotation tool back here. Started dragging the screen around. You'll see example 3 friction circle is the name of the session. It was recorded on 1/26 of 2020 at 8:24 a.m. So if you're looking for it right now, that's how you can find it. And this is a really, really great example of a good example and a bad example of a friction circle. And we'll talk about first, what is the friction circle? What in the world is it? What does it mean? And what can we learn from it? So I'm going to hop right in here. I'm going to tap this data file and get started. So you'll notice in the app, it's going to save our last view. So we were looking at long G and long G. That view is going to be retained. So when we open the app, we're seeing the same exact points that we had established before. Now to view the friction circle, we're going to go to this arrow on the right side of the screen, and I'm going to tap that arrow. We'll get to our second page here, and then our third page is going to be the friction circle. So we're looking for this graph right here, this plot. It's going to be a lot of little data points plotted on a just an XY graph. Same thing that we're seeing down here in a lot of ways, or same plotting method, but it's going to be showing us something totally different. Now, what's interesting about the friction circle is this concept hasn't been around for a super long time. It was actually kind of pioneered in like the 60s, late 60s. Mark Donahue kind of coined this term and was the first person to really measure accelerations and put it on an XY plot like this to look at the potential of the car, or where the limit of the tire is. So the whole idea with the friction circle is to help us understand the tire. It's to help us understand how much acceleration the car can withstand. And just like the speed trace and the long G trace, it's pretty straightforward to look at once we know what we're looking at. And just the shape of it, or the concentration of the plots, can tell us a lot. So we'll jump right in if that's making any sense whatsoever. And guys, feel free to drop questions. And like Dion said at the beginning in the Q&A session, in the Q&A deal, and we'll get to it at the end.
For us there already, which is good.
Awesome.
So adding those in.
Cool. So first thing we'll do when we look at the friction circle, if you've got this in your data right now, find where you see 0.0 on the bottom right here. All right, I'm going to draw a line straight up. That's our 0 axis. Everything to the right of this line is turning to the right. So when the steering wheel is turned to the right, the left springs are loaded, right? Dots get plotted on the right side. Everything to the left of the green line, that's turning to the left, right? Turning your steering wheel to the left. So you'll notice there's negative values over here on the left side. I forget the naming convention for it, but basically there's a lot of different measurement systems out there, but usually left-hand accelerations, and there might be someone who knows this stuff better than I do, but they're always going to be valued as negative accelerations, even though it's the same force, right? Technically, even deceleration, when we talked about longitudinal G, is acceleration. Deceleration is like a subtopic of acceleration. It's all considered acceleration. So negative is going to be left-hand turns. Positive is going to be right-hand turns. So think about this literally. This is not where the weight transfer is in the car. This is not where the load is. This is, I'm turning to the right, dots get plotted on the right. Turning to the left, dots get plotted on the left. Cool. Not super straightforward and easy to understand. I get that. It took me a while to really orient myself with this. So if you're frustrated or don't understand it, just continue to kind of think about and challenge yourself. I know it's a little bit vague of a concept at first, but it starts to make a lot of sense. So I found my 0.0 line here on the left side. This red line, that's going to be 0 longitudinal G. All right, so everything below the line is negative longitudinal G values. That's going to be deceleration. So anything below this, pretty much we're on the brake pedal, right? Or we're we're using a little bit of brake or a lot of scrub in the middle of it, right? The car's decelerating. Anything above this line, we're on the gas pedal, we're accelerating. The car's accelerating. So real quick, and we'll do another little kind of quiz because I think that's a lot of fun, and I really hope you guys are enjoying that. If there are dots plotted in this upper right quadrant, what does that mean? Which direction is the car turning, and is the car accelerating or decelerating? Do, 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 do. Have anything yet? Right acceleration, accelerating to the right. Yep, but I'm looking for two different things. Which direction? And are we on the gas pedal or the brake pedal? Oh, Dion, I think you're muted.
My bad. That was you. We're getting a couple answers here already. Gas to the right acceleration.
There we go. John, hey, John, what's up? I know John. I hope your new track car build is going well, John. Very cool. Right acceleration on the gas. Martin, I know Martin as well. Good stuff. All right. Yes, those were all correct. 1 second here. I just got my annotations all messed up on the screen. Okay, so if we're looking at dots in this upper right quadrant, we're turning the steering wheel to the right, right? I'll do it like this, to the right, and we're on the right pedal, the gas pedal, right? That's what plots dots here. So if we're turning to the right and we're on the brake pedal, that plots dots down here. Okay, same thing over here, turning to the left on the gas pedal, turning to the left on the brake pedal. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. That's kind of the baseline understanding that we need to kind of go into this. I'm going to leave the axes right here. So what we're looking at now is going to be the shape. All right, the shape. So the shape itself, like the outline of the friction circle, is very important, but so is the center. So is the concentration of these plots. We see all these dots right here plotted around 0.2, 0.3 positive. All right, that's very important to remember when we're looking at this. There's a lot of dots right there. You might have already guessed this, but that's not a good thing. We don't want dots plotted in the middle, right? We want dots plotted around the outside edges, That let's think about this very literally and from actually driving the car, right? If we're accelerating at 0.2 G like we are on all these acceleration points right here, that's not accelerating at the limit of this car's capability. In this case, this car will accelerate right here. It'll accelerate really, really hard. This is a 911 turbo. So this car will accelerate at close to 0.6 positive G, which I'll tell you right now is really fast. That's very aggressive, especially not doing a standing start, right? Especially in second or third gear. All these dots plotted right here are going to represent coasting. That's going to be not on the throttle, not on the brake, just kind of cruising around. 0.6 G, maybe a little bit of throttle, right? Not wide open throttle. So we immediately know, just looking at if I was looking at this driver's data, I could pop over to the speed trace and know immediately right away the conversation that I need to have with this guy. And there is zero confidence. There's a lot of coasting. There's a lot of hesitancy with the throttle. And I see very few dots plotted along the outside edge of the friction circle, very low concentration. The shape of the friction circle I mentioned before was also very important. And we want it to kind of have a pear shape. We want it to basically have this type of shape where it's expanding a little bit at the top and at peak lateral G. And it starts to kind of get more concave as we get closer to our peak deceleration, which is down here. But we want it to kind of bow out as well. And this is something, if you've ever watched those videos where you see the little circle and there's some other smaller circles in it, maybe there's crosshairs on it, and it's got a little dot bouncing around. That's exactly what we're looking at here. A lot of people put that in their video overlays on YouTube. All of your YouTube track day warriors out there that have their little G dot bouncing around, that's plotting the friction circle. That's exactly what that's showing us. So really quickly, I'm gonna toggle this bottom one back to the speed trace. This is at Sebring again. I'm gonna tap the play button in the bottom right corner right here. And what that's gonna do is show us, and I'm gonna change the color as well here. That's gonna show us a blue dot and where that blue dot is on the friction circle and where it is on the speed trace. So I can start to learn not only where on the track this is, but at what speeds is the car accelerating in a certain direction, all right? So right now we're accelerating, turning to the left. This is exiting turn 1. Now we're accelerating straight. We're heading towards turn 3. We're kind of coasting. We're coasting. We're coasting. And now we're going to be braking really hard right now. See how the dot went south, went really steeply down? That's braking. Now, when we're way out here, that's actually evidence of trail braking. That's showing us combined G, meaning we're decelerating and we're cornering pretty aggressively. All right, decelerating and cornering pretty aggressively. If you look in the top right, you'll see the exact values. You'll see negative 0.66 and negative 0.46. So the first value is going to be lateral G, so that's going to be cornering force. So negative 0.68, is going to be lateral G to the left, and then negative 0.46 is going to be longitudinal G, deceleration. So that's going to be your combined G forces. I find this to be the simplest way. Another way that we could do this even simpler is if I go to the friction circle on my bottom screen down here, and if I go to the track map on my top screen, and I press that same play button. All right, now we can watch the position of the car on the map as well as the dot on the friction circle. And we can see what corners plot certain acceleration. So right now we're in this left-hand corner. The car is turning to the left. Look at that dot. It's on the far left side of the friction circle. Hopefully that's all starting to piece together what we're looking at. Let's look at a good example of what the friction circle looks like, because I don't want to beat into your head a bad example, but I wanted to emphasize, I think it's important to be able to note the difference between a good and a bad one. So let's remember, lots of dots in the middle. Lots of dots in the middle. That's going to represent coasting, not accelerating hard. Very small concentration of dots on the outside means the driver's spending very little time at the limit of the tire. All right. If I go to select this lap, this is actually a really specific, but the owner of the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 lap. This last lap down here was a pro coach, and he set a baseline, and his friction circle is going to look very different. All right. Now we're looking at this 224 lap. Does everybody see the difference here? Let's just do that one more time. Look at all these dots in the middle. I'm going to leave my arrow there. Look at that. This driver's almost plotting no dots at positive 0.2 longitudinal G acceleration. But a lot of different edges, the edges are so different, right? There's way along the outside edges. So if you're looking at your data and what is this thing? What is this that I see? Just go and look at the concentration of dots. Are there a lot concentrated in the middle, or are they spread around the edges? If they're in the middle, you immediately know that you're probably spending too much time at partial throttle or partial brake. You're not spending enough time actually at the limit of the tire. Dion, with the friction circle, you mentioned earlier, you like coasting. Coasting's good, and I agree with you. People that say you're either wide open throttle, max brake, obviously no motorsports or driving are completely inept. The friction circle is a really good representation of that, because if there's right here, this is maximum lateral G. This is like 1.2 lateral G. That's you being thrown into the right side of the car, return to the left, all the loads in the right like that. If the car at that amount of lateral G, you can't go to the throttle, right? The tire is totally maxed, right? It's total limit. A really slight hesitation, and you have to wait for that value to decrease a little bit before you can actually get on the throttle. That's why we don't see our peak lateral G values above the 0 axis right here. Right here's our 0 axis. Look at these peak lateral G values. They're right below or right near. And that means a really fast driver at that point on the track is getting everything out of the tire laterally and has to throttle. That usually strong drive. So hopefully there's information under there that you can unpack. But basically what we're looking at is an empty middle versus middle, right? Stacked middle is bad, and empty middle, the friction circle is good. Yeah, that's a lot of information on the friction circle, but I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely. So I would say let's go ahead and move over to the Q&A really quick. If it's already been going for an hour and a half, so I'd say let's fly through some questions here. Are you good with that, Andrew?
Let's do it.
Awesome. So if you guys haven't already, if you're in full screen, it can be hard to see it. Maybe hit escape. Move your mouse over to where the friction circle is. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Click that, open it up. You can kind of answer and ask questions, comment on others. So the very first question here is, do you change the length or aggression in any brake zone as the race goes on in terms of fuel burn off, as it relates to a V or a U shape, or should the trace be consistent no matter what lap you choose to analyze? I think I can try to start on that one. Things change. As the race goes on, the grip starts to either come back to you, go away, the fuel load changes. A lot depends on other priorities. So for me, what I first do is identify what do I need to execute on this corner? Are my goals to get back to full throttle as early as possible? Are my goals entry speed? What do I need to execute on? And from there, I'll let things change. So as an example, we talked a lot about Sebring, and I know during the 12-hour, the grip changes a ton through there. So for me, I look at turn 10 at Sebring is a corner where my brake zone changes a lot. Now, what I want to execute on is getting back to aggressive throttle right at the apex point, no earlier, and then getting back to full throttle almost as soon as my hands are straight before I turn into 11 and 12. Now, I can't brake at the same place, the same time to do that. As the stint goes on, my initial brake zone is the thing that's probably going to fluctuate. So if I were to brake at the same point, eventually I'm probably going to lose the rear on entry because I can't sustain that level of front weight per grip. So rather than trying to come off the brakes and roll more entry speed, I'm going to brake earlier so that at the turning point, I have a little bit, pretty much the same amount of brake pressure that I need. So what you're going to see, to answer this as easy as I can, is your initial brake zone is probably the thing that's going to change. So yes, the length of your brake zone is going to change, but typically that V or U shape is going to remain constant. Now, the aggressiveness of it may fluctuate subtly, but not massively. Would you agree with that, Andrew?
100%.
Cool.
I think, Chris, as far as the speed trace goes, it's probably going to look very similar, but like Jason said, with a heavier fuel load, that's going to change where you have to brake. You probably have to slow down a little bit sooner, or the car's, stability is going to change. It depends greatly. I mean, are we talking an endurance race where we're running through a full tank of fuel? Are we talking a 30-minute sprint race where we're only using a little bit of fuel? The car, where the fuel is located in the car, but the speed trace itself, the shape of it is not going to change. And your minimum corner speed is probably not going to change very much either. In fact, your minimum corner speed, let's say turn 7, really slow corner at Sebring, is probably within 5 miles an hour between my Honda Civic rental car and a GT3 Cup car.
Yep.
Right. It's pretty close. What's different is how quickly the car slows to that speed and how quickly it accelerates away from it and how much combined G it'll take entering the corner. Awesome.
Yep.
Sure. What do we want to attack next, Dion?
Awesome. So we got a question here from Jason, which is, can you explain trail braking? To be honest with you, that's something that we can talk for days on. I'll hit on it a little bit here, but I do want to recommend for anyone that is a Driver's Lounge subscriber, and if you're not, I'll add that link again. I actually have a hour-long plus webinar just like this explaining trail brake, because I know that's something that there's a lot of confusion around. So I do really recommend go checking that out, Jason. So essentially what trail braking is all about using the weight transfer of the car effectively. So what trail braking is the release of the brakes so that at the turn-in point, we're still on the brakes. But really effective trail braking is where, for the most part, your big toe is just like resting on the brake pedal. And for me, it's more of a keep weight on the front end rather than trying to slow the car down. And what we're doing with that is by keeping the weight on the front end, you're getting rotation. Now, notice rotation and oversteer are the same thing, but oftentimes we talk about oversteer as a negative and rotation as positive. So I use the word rotation. Yes, you do want a little bit of yaw in the car. So that weight on the front helps the rotation. So what it allows you to do is allows you to start to unwind the steering wheel sooner at the exit or more aggressively at the exit so you can get back to full throttle earlier. So what trail braking does is it manipulates the weight of the car to allow you to roll more entry speed while also getting back to full throttle earlier. Now, there's a lot beyond that. You know, how aggressive do you trail brake? What corners do you trail brake on? Conditions. Like I said, we could talk for days. So hopefully at a very high level that explained it, but I really do recommend you checking out that webinar because it's an important topic. And if you want to be fast, it's something that you have to be getting better at. Do you want to add anything there, Andrew?
Yeah, all I got on trail braking is it's releasing the brake pedal as you turn the wheel.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep. Absolutely. Scott Spear, want to jump into Scott's questions? I know Scott. What's up, man? Hope your Miata's doing well.
And I'll let you take that one. You probably know more than me there.
Regarding braking performance, should your max braking G equal your max lateral G? Excellent question, Scott. It depends. Common thread. What tire? RE71 maybe? Usually your max longitudinal deceleration, your peak braking force that's going to create the most negative longitudinal G, and your peak lateral G are going to be very close. Most 200 tread wear category tires will do a little more laterally than they will longitudinally. Most like our compound tires will do almost the exact same in either axis. So if your tire will do 1.2 laterally, a good assumption is it should be able to do very close to 1.2. Actually, some of the data we looked at from the car I was in at Barber that I talked about briefly, I could only get negative 0.96 G on longitudinal deceleration and about 1.2, a little over 1.2 laterally. And that was actually due to the fact that I was applying the brakes in turn 5 pretty far after the track went downhill. And so the road conditions kept the car from slowing down at closer to 1.2. On flat ground, the tire would probably do 1.1. So yes, I'm going to say it's within 0.15, 0.2 G, longitudinal peak to lateral peak.
Awesome. So this next question from Track PC is, what do you use how do you use data on a track you don't know? I think a lot of what we talked about today would be a good example of that. You know, how the slopes of the lines are on the top of your curves, on the bottom of your curves. Often one thing I look at heavily is where am I picking up initial throttle, making sure my initial throttle is coming exactly where it should be. I think a lot of what we covered today works really well on tracks that we don't know yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say rewatch the webinar. 100%. Knowing what the top of the speed trace means, knowing what the bottom of the speed trace means. The thing you're going to have to do a little more research on is this a faster or a slower corner, and maybe understanding is this the type of corner where you want a V shape in your speed trace or a U shape? That would be important. But being able to look at the app just like we did and any data just like we did, if you see that double brake application, if you see that U speed trace on a slower corner, you don't have to know the track. Honestly, I look at a lot of drivers' data that I've never been to the racetrack before, and I can immediately look at some stuff and speak relatively intelligently on it just because I know how to look at the data. And then I can kind of go in and do a little research on the track, watch some videos, and hopefully drive it, because you're really not complete until you drive it to understand it more completely.
Absolutely. All righty. So Martin, is the next question here. When you have two dots racing around the screen in the satellite view, the LED displayed, what car is it indicating?
Sure. I know, Martin. How's it going, Martin? So when you're talking about this screen right here, satellite screen, which is this top screen, we've got two cars overlaid, so 2 laps. So I've got a blue check mark and a red check mark. So we see 2 laps. Both the speedometer, which is here on the left side of the screen, and the Apex Pro light display are going to be showing what the blue dot was experiencing. So those references, the speed, and the apex lights are going to be associated with the blue dot.
Cool. Awesome. So far, it looks like the last question might be here from Eric. What's good to quickly review between runs at an autocross?
Ooh, good question, Eric. I would go to the friction circle. I'd spend a lot of time learning exactly what you're looking at here, because on the autocross, a lot of times when you're staging between runs, so say you go out and you do a run, you come back in, you get your time. A lot of times you file back into the run line again, depending on how your club does it. So you might only have a couple minutes. You might not even be able to take your helmet off. I would go in and look at the shape of this friction circle. If you struggle with underdriving the car a little bit, not quite knowing if you're at the limit of the tire, I would definitely go here. Look for those concentration of dots, same exact thing as a road course. You want to see the concentration of dots on the outside of the friction circle, less dots in the middle. That's immediately what I would look at pretty quickly. I would also go in and replay the Apex Pro LED display over the lap and look for corners where you're seeing a lot of red lights. We didn't get into what the lights mean, but basically those lights are showing you what that friction circle display is showing you, but they're going to be modified for the conditions of the track based on the accelerations that you've already shown the device, and it's learned some of those data points. So those are the two things I would do: friction circle, and then go back and hit this play button down here in the bottom right corner and replay the position of the car on the course, and watch this guy right here, the light bar.
Awesome. If no one else has any questions, we'll leave it open here for just a little bit longer. Hopefully, if you have a question, you can answer or ask it really quick. If not, I think we're ready to wrap this up. Looks like we're good to go. Andrew, thanks again to Apex Pro for making this webinar totally free to everyone. Really appreciate that, and appreciate you coming in here and dropping some knowledge. And thanks to everyone joining us. Hopefully you all learned something and enjoyed it. Hopefully it helps you this season. And of course, if you guys have questions, anything else, team at Apex Pro is always available. They're great at responding. I can't talk anymore, apparently. And of course, at Racers360, we'd love to work with you either on a personalized coaching or a driver's lounge, where the link is to 10% off. Come join us today. And again, if you've got questions, email us at team@racers360.com. We're always happy to help and talk racing. So thanks again.
Cool.
Best of luck this year.
Thanks, Dion. I just dropped a link to Apex Pro Lap Timer Plus, guys. We really appreciate. Heard from a bunch of people that are already using Apex Pro on here. Thanks a ton for your business. Make sure you check out Lap Timer Plus. We'll do another webinar maybe sometime and talk about predicted lap time and what that is. But I really appreciate the opportunity, Dion. It's a pleasure.
Of course, absolutely. All about bringing the sport forward. Have a good night, everyone.
Awesome. See you later.